Hi, my name is Robin Collins, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how you'll develop the skills to identify fashion trends in relation to hairdressing. You'll find resources and the assessment requirements on the topic block at Inditech Online in the topic block for fashion trends. The assessment for this particular topic is an assignment that you need to identify where you source your information from. You need to make a statement of where you think fashion trends are at. You need to illustrate fashion trends. And I'll recap on this later in the video. Right now I want to talk about fashion, and hairdressing is a fashion industry, and most of us who join hairdressing will actually have some sense of fashion or where fashion trends are at, or certainly you'll have an interest in it. We all know that fashion is very changeable, and that the inspirations and influences on fashion come from lots of areas. So I guess the skill when we're identifying a fashion trend and the importance of that skill comes in our client base. We can't work with design, whether we're designing colour or whether we're designing cuts or whether we have a client that says to us, so what's fashionable at the moment? We can't function or provide adequate service if we have no idea how to identify those fashion trends. So this particular unit is a really important foundation skill for all stylists, and it's certainly a very important skill that we need to develop on an ongoing basis. We don't just do it once and then never do it again. We should be looking at things over and over and over on a very regular basis. I think the most important skill in trend mapping or finding out where fashion is at is the ability to research and the ability to reflect on what we see in that research and what influences our research. So that brings me to the area of sourcing your information, and this is probably one of the first areas in your assignment. As a stylist, where do we source our information from? Now most of us who have been working in industry or who have an interest in fashion will have that ability to research, but I'm going to give you a list of where we will source that information just in case you don't quite know where to start. So if we start with sourcing information from the internet, there's just any number of places on the internet that we can source information. If we look at movies or TVs, we can often get some inspiration from movies, or we might find that some of the looks on a movie or even in music videos might actually inspire us to take something and make it ours or bring it into where fashion is at. Sometimes we use magazines and newspapers to support our fashion trend mapping. Industry events, competitions, seminars, icons and leaders in our industry, we might see what they're doing and think, wow, that's really cool. Let's take that and let's bring it into our own world of hairdressing. Social observation and people watching is a real favourite of mine. I like to sort of sit, have coffee, see where people are at. There's, that social climate, what people are wearing, just their overall attitude to life, and what you take from that you can bring into your fashion trend mapping as well. I think certainly the social trends have a high impact because they change and evolve, and it doesn't matter how old you are or how long you've been in hairdressing. It's really important that you actually sit back and look at what's happening in our cultures and in our social trends, not just in your own little nuclear bubble either. Take a trip somewhere and sit at cafes and watch the people and see what they're wearing. If you go overseas, don't just sort of go overseas to do your big trip and sightsee. Take note of the people and the cultures and use that to inspire your own sense of fashion and your own interpretation of fashion. I think aside from the sources of information, we need to look at what influences fashion. And I talk a lot about what inspires my fashion, and a lot of stylists will talk about what inspires their looks and their designs. Influencing and inspiration are similar things. So we might take inspiration from nature, for example, particularly with colour work in autumn when you get those beautiful warm tones, and you might, for example, pick up an autumn leaf that's faded into autumn tones, and it's not one colour, but it has this amazing hue of warm tones of reds and golds and oranges, and that might inspire some of your colour placement, or it might inspire some of your colour tones or your shades or whatever you're using with your clients. Now that example is important in terms of, yes, I'm taking inspiration from it, but it certainly does influence our work. So as I've said, influence and inspiration are similar, have similar impacts on our fashion trend and trend mapping. Where do I get inspiration from, and where other stylists get inspiration from comes from many places. Now, as I've said, nature is one, and often even just going to the beach and watching the movement of waves and the surf and the sea swirling around, you might take some inspiration from that to make hair move, for example. You might use buildings or architecture to influence where your design lines sit, you know, angles and levels and textures and structure, whether they're strong or soft or bold or particularly geometric. And that comes through in our fashion and in our hair. So if we look at how, perhaps for one example, architecture will influence fashion, you might see, for example, the fashion trends in clothing become very structured and strong and bold and structured. And that can be taken, that inspiration could have been taken from the designs in architecture and buildings. You might see, for example, we go through a fashion era or trend of things that are very soft and floaty. That inspiration may have been taken from culture, for example. You know, people have become very ethereal and very floaty, and they're wearing floaty clothes, and they talk softly, and they carry themselves differently. That will come into our clothing and into our hair. Everything tends to work in harmony, and I think that's a really important fact for you to bring into your work. Your trend mapping, your fashion and your clothes, our fashion and our clothes, our trend mapping, hairdressing as an industry all needs to be harmonious. So when you design if you, for example, designed a strong shape, you would create a strong colour to work in harmony. If you had a soft, floaty shape, then you may have perhaps a soft, more textured, floaty colour to work harmoniously with your shape. If you are looking or searching for inspirations, like I've said, we draw from many areas. So we could work from nature, we could work from buildings, we might work from textures, or we might be staring at a pattern of paisley and take inspiration from that. We may take inspiration from social cultures. For example, we might go through a phase in hairdressing or in fashion where things are particularly tribal or Celtic-y, or in terms of retro if you're looking at a social culture, or you know, back in the 80s where everything was sort of very punk, that was definitely a social culture. We see, you know, emo and gothic influences in our hairdressing. So we would take some inspiration, or things that influence fashion would come from social and cultural areas as well. One of the biggest influences on fashion in hairdressing and in clothing is the impact of history. And you will often see things that have gone round and round and round in history that come back in a slightly altered form in the now. So, for example, where we're seeing wave and movement in hairdressing at the moment, there is a distinct link back to that 40s look of the finger waves coming into the lovely curls through the perimeter area. Now that's already been done, but we've brought it into the now, so we're actually changing that, what it was then in the 40s, and making it ours. With your own hairdressing and with your own fashion, you will take those influences and those inspirations and you will own them. You'll put your own signature on them, you'll put your own interpretation on them, and you'll bring them into your client base with your own interpretation as well. If I'm talking about how we actually develop the skill to do it, to do this, to actually trend map, what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to sit back and look and think, this is my research. What do I see? What pattern do I see from here to here? If I'm seeing a pattern in people on the street wearing something that I decide, if, for example, if I decided movement in the perimeter was where fashion is at, if I saw that emerging through some of your fashion magazines, some of your industry shows, some of your street fashion newspapers, then you'd see that there is a pattern. Sometimes you have to go looking for that pattern to actually confirm that that's where fashion is at. If you're not seeing it, then you have to find something to support it. You can be a trendsetter, so you can decide, this is where I think fashion is going to be at and I'm going to be a leader, but you have to find supporting evidence. If that's where you say fashion is at, you might say, look at architecture, the angles are changing, look at textiles and fabrics, the colours are changing, or the patterns of the textiles and fabrics is changing. If you were going to be a leader, you would say, I believe this is the next step and this is why. We've seen this, we've seen that, and historically, if I take the next step, it will go to where I'm saying it's at. I hope that makes sense to you. It's a little bit like fashion trends is how long is a piece of string, because it's an individual's interpretation of where fashion is at. Now, while that's very broad, there's certain structures in place. You can't just be making a statement that no one's seeing evidence of in fashion. So, for example, I wouldn't suddenly say, I think fashion is hair down to your knees, because there's no evidence of that. So it has to be real. It has to be a real trend or a real pattern. Like I've said, you'll have developed the skill to research because you know where to source your information from. You will take inspiration from a variety of places, as I've said earlier. You will use that inspiration and put your own twist or signature on it, and then you will look to see if there is a pattern within your sources of information that support your interpretation of fashion. So let's now look at the assessment for this unit again, and we're going to go through this so that you're clear on what's required of you. You need to make a list of where you source your information from. So you simply will make a list or a bibliography in your style file or your assignment if you make a movie. You can use whatever method you want to demonstrate your knowledge of fashion trends, as long as you cover off the requirements of the assessment. So you might make a huge great big poster to put on the wall in your salon, or you might create a style file, and that's probably a really useful tool because you'll use that on an ongoing basis in your life as a hairdresser. And it's really important in a salon to have your own style file with work in it that relates to who you are as a hairdresser, as opposed to working from magazines that have all been created by other people, and you don't necessarily like the work that's there, and you may not even be capable of the work that's in those magazines. So the last thing you want is just as a client coming into the salon saying, I want this image, and you think, oh, I've got no idea how to create that. So create your own style file, and if you're completing this particular unit, you will develop a style file to illustrate where current fashion trends are at and your interpretation of that. And you can use that within your client base as well. So once you've actually listed your sources of information, you will then make a statement or a mind map of where you think fashion is at. You will illustrate from that a range of hairstyles. So you'll need to have a range of short hair, long hair, curly hair, of colours, of hair up, and of special events. And within that, those imagery or those images need to match your statement. And once you've actually got those images together, you will then create images or collect images of the influences or the inspirations in your fashion trends. So if you have a collection of images and you think that they're influenced by social trends or by nature or by architecture or whatever, you need to put imagery to support that. I'm just going to touch on the hair up and the special events. I think historically when I've been tutoring, you'll have a lot of stylists who present you with this particular style file or this particular assignment, and they will have hair up and special events, and they sort of all float into one. It's important that you have something that's distinctly separate. The hair up has to be hair up. They can be informal hair ups and formal hair ups, because we have that in the salon. We have clients who come in and they want a slightly less formal hair up, but they want the hair up. And then we'll have clients that want a very formal hair up. With the special events, it's not just about having a wedding as a special event. It's about perhaps a catwalk show, or if you had styles that you were creating for the wearable arts show, or the Fashion Week hair show, or a particular fundraising event, or something where you had to do something that was slightly a little bit more avant-garde, or if you were looking for inspiration to create something that was a little bit more avant-garde. That's where the special event area works. We need you to actually be looking, researching and finding styles that are not worn on a day-to-day basis. So dig deep and find some truly avant-garde work. It doesn't mean you actually have to do the work. You're just going to use that information for inspiration. Okay, so just recapping on what I've talked about in this particular video, I have hopefully given you some ideas on how you will actually trend map and how you develop the skills to take fashion and own it and present that to your clients. I've also gone through what the assignment requirements are, and that is your sources of information, your statement of where you think fashion is at, your images of each group of hairstyle, your images of influences on hairdressing fashion. And yeah, good luck and enjoy this particular topic. It's going to benefit you greatly.